2 weeks after helping carry his best friend's coffin, the man received a voicemail. He pressed play right there, not thinking much of it, and on the other end, he heard the guy's voice. The voice sounded like someone who was almost asking for forgiveness even before explaining why. The man in the recording said he felt numb, that God had crushed him, that God had finally gotten his attention. He begged to arrange a face-to-face meeting because he needed to ask for forgiveness. The friend of this guy who received the message had been shot dead not long ago. So that's what immediately came to his mind at that moment. After all, what other reason would this guy have to call like that, or rather send a message out of nowhere 2 weeks after the death of his other friend, begging for forgiveness? Didn't the whole thing have anything to do with him? At least that's what the police said, because the investigation was convinced it was a robbery. Some random thief broke in, shot, and ran off like a coward. I'm Marcos Campos, and this is the story of a man who was executed in an empty warehouse where he worked. He only went there every now and then. A case that the police almost shelved, but later became one of the most talked about convictions in that area. So today, let's investigate all of this in detail together. The strange message, the reason why the police thought it was just a random theft followed by robbery and murder, right? And all the other details of this tangled web, this chain of criminal events. Are we set? Let's get to the facts. Everything happened on August 17, 2014. The man who died was named Robert Lyman, but everyone knew him as Robbie. He was 38 years old, the father of 2 young children, and he worked for one of the biggest railroads in the country. That day, he had been assigned to work in a rail yard that was far away, hours away by car from his home, in a very isolated corner there, where he had hardly ever set foot before. It was one of those deserted places, you know, no movement. Where the employee assigned there working that shift spends the whole day practically without crossing paths with a living soul. And that's exactly what was happening that day. Robbie was there alone inside that warehouse. At some point during that shift, someone entered the warehouse, and that person fired 2 shots. They hit Robbie in the chest on the right side. And then, this killer messed up the whole scene, scattered things around, clearly trying to make it look like it was a robbery, you know? And to finish, he fired the last shot at Robbie's face to make sure he wouldn't survive, and then he just left. Pretty cold-blooded killer, isn't he? So it was a coworker who arrived there later and found Robbie's body on the floor. Panicking, this coworker called emergency services. You could even hear the desperation in his voice, saying, "Oh my God," and repeating that his friend was lying there, bleeding from the head. And then, the problem that would haunt the investigators for the following months began. I don't know if it would have haunted them that much, you know, if it weren't for some twists of fate. But just look at this. Because the first question in any case like this is the simplest one in the world, right? Who would want Robbie dead? But in Robbie's case, the answer was nothing. The detectives talked to his coworkers, and the description was always the same. Robbie had no enemies, didn't owe anyone money, he wasn't hanging out with the wrong crowd, you know? It was the opposite of that. He was the kind of guy who was always at the top of the list, for example, when the neighbors were having a barbecue. He was the kind of person who would stop what he was doing to help a coworker. He had no enemies, no debts, not even any loose ends that could point to any apparent reason. So the explanation that was left was the most convenient one, right? The one that fit that environment, a robbery followed by murder. The scene had everything for that, right? It was set up to tell that story, and it fit perfectly because it was the only one that didn't require anyone to hate Robbie. Strange, a crime of opportunity, just pure bad luck for poor Robbie, right? But look at how the killer really laid his cards on the table, you see? He didn't just kill the man. He planted an entire narrative so the police could go after someone else instead of him. And for a while, the bait worked. And to try to fill that gap, let's say the investigators went after the cameras in the area, anywhere near the yard. In one footage, an unknown man walks through the area, kind of limping with a strange way of stepping. The detectives also started tracking down the identity of every driver who had passed through there that day, and they managed to name those drivers through the car records. And they named almost everyone they saw. Almost everyone. Because there was one exception. the guy who was on a motorcycle. That one they couldn't identify at all. He was practically a ghost rider who had passed by at almost exactly the time when the robbery and murder happened. A guy with no name, not even a face. And that's when the investigation kind of stalled. There was a strange man there, limping, who showed up on a camera, then a biker they couldn't identify, a victim with no enemies, and a scene that looked like a robbery. It really seemed like a dead-end case, but for those who know about investigations, there's a path to follow that they haven't taken yet. Anyone want to take a guess? Yeah, getting to know Rob's personal life, what he was doing at home, because in cases like this, that's often the key to everything, right? Rob was married to a woman named Sabrina. The two of them lived in a planned community up in the California high desert, a really well-built place, around an artificial lake, the kind you see in real estate brochures, you know? Like the perfect little spot to live, raise your kids, far from the chaos of the big city, neat little houses, barbecues in the backyard, kids playing outside until late. And in that picture-perfect ad-like setting, Rob and Sabrina were the couple everyone else used as the standard. They even had a name for the group they created there. They called themselves the Pack. Their friends swore the two never fought, that they were always together, and they were the example of a relationship that worked, you know, and everyone could see it. But there's always a but, isn't there? This magazine cover image actually hid a whole dynamic the neighbors knew nothing about. Back in 2008, the couple made a particular and peculiar decision, I would say, to open their marriage. That's right. They started going out with other couples, taking adults-only trips, drinking heavily at parties, and sometimes even inviting other couples into their home. For them, at that moment, it was just a way to spice up their life as a couple, you know, their routine, which had already fallen into, I don't know, a bit of a rut, you know? I think everyone gets what I mean, right? But over time, according to what Sabrina's sister would say later, she ended up getting tired of that lifestyle. She got tired of the drinking, which wouldn't stop, and started wanting a different direction for her life. She wanted to go back to the church she used to attend, basically trade those parties for a pew at church on Sundays. However, Rob still didn't want that. He was comfortable with his life and didn't want to change his lifestyle, right? And her sister also said that at that time, Sabrina drank so much all the time that she was kind of numb, you know, absent from her own life. She was a woman trying to get out of a situation that was clearly getting complicated, and she couldn't manage to bring her husband along with her, right? And at this point in the story, if we were part of the official investigation, I'd say we should write this down now. Some things, right? Assuming that we would have that information, right? It's not said, but maybe the sister knew about this from the beginning. Anyway, let's suppose the sister knew, and we managed to interview her and got this information about a devastated wife. Already fed up with that lifestyle, wanting, I don't know, to change direction, right? And bring her husband along with her, but the husband was hesitant. He didn't want to. He wanted to keep living the way he was. For him, it was fine, right? I would also look at it from the perspective that maybe the marriage didn't make much sense for Sabrina anymore. Why? When Rob died, it was exactly this woman, completely fragile, religious, lost, that the whole community rushed to support. What it seems is that nobody knew how they were living their lives there, right? Behind closed doors and so on. I'm saying this because she seemed so fragile, because everyone embraced her, right? Friends, anyway, took turns bringing food to her house. Every day after Rob's passing, they would pool money to help the family, take care of the kids. And no one in their right mind looked at that widow there, completely shattered, broken, and thought of anything other than, you know, protecting that grieving woman. But hold on, it's too soon for hasty decisions, because I know exactly what you're thinking right now. It was in the middle of this morning that Jason, Rob's friend, got a call. Remember that man who opened the episode, who after 2 weeks carrying Rob's coffin got a strange message there? Yeah. This friend of Rob, Jason, was a firefighter, and when he stopped to think, right, who had left that message for him? Him. For what reason? Someone would ask for forgiveness like that for a death that, until then, everyone thought was really a robbery gone wrong. And then, when he started to connect the dots, he remembered his friend there. Because until then, in that message, the guy hadn't identified himself. And then, he remembered a younger guy who had already been part of his circle of friends from work, including because he was also a firefighter who had trained with him. Anyway, he had already spent time with him at some point in his life, and it was this guy who came to his mind. I'm sure you must be thinking, but why Jason Wright, this firefighter friend of Rob? He remembered this other young firefighter too, didn't he? It's because about a year before Rob's death, this same guy had confessed something. Guess what? He was having an affair with Sabrina, the wife of poor Rob, and this affair wasn't kept secret just between the two lovers, okay? At some point, the guy himself went to Rob and confessed everything to his face, so it's likely that Rob must have talked to Jason about it. The marriage? Was it shaken? Did Sabrina promise to end everything? Well, hold on, I'll get to that in a moment. Let me tell you first how this fling between the two of them started, okay? The firefighter here is Sabrina. Sometime before everything happened, Sabrina had gotten a part-time job at a wholesale store. You know those huge supermarkets where you buy in bulk? That's right. And she spent her whole shift there offering product samples to the customers walking around going through the aisles, right? One random day, purely by chance, a customer walked by and started chatting with her. Guess what? A firefighter, much younger than her, who asked for her number right then and there, and according to him, he only realized she was married much later, okay? And what brought the two of them together, let's say, wasn't sex or a fling. It was religion. Both of them said they were devout Christians. They were always talking about God, about faith, about purpose. And for a woman who, as we remember, was trying to leave that life behind, of going out with different people and so on, even though she was married, that really fit her perfectly. A younger guy, religious, full of good intentions, seemed exactly like what she wanted, right? A way out of that marriage. So I say, she could have just ended the marriage and been happy, right? Well, that's not what happened, is it? They stayed married and then that whole situation. And right after that firefighter told Rob what happened, Rob turned up dead. Weeks later, that same guy calls begging Jason for forgiveness. Jason, Rob's friend, when he got the call, started putting the pieces together, and then he said, "I'm going to hand this recording over to the detectives. After all, they're just running in circles, right? Saying it was a robbery gone wrong. They didn't even want to take a closer look at his personal life." Well, he handed over the recording. And this is one of the most important links in this chain, because from this tip, the investigators looked at this young man more closely for the first time, and what they found. All of this will start to make sense, but man, honestly, I was like, his friend had to get a random call from the guy, all regretful and everything. It really seemed like he got religious, like he regretted it and all. Wouldn't the police check his record to see if there's anything, right? After all, the guy died there in the warehouse where he worked just like that, out of nowhere, with no history of theft there. Strange, right? They should have looked closer. But anyway, when the investigation finally looked into the guy, they found out he had a high-caliber weapon similar to the one that killed Rob. And he also rode a motorcycle and wore clothes similar to that so-called Ghost Rider from the cameras, remember? So then we had the biker, the weapon. It seemed like things were really coming together, right? And there was more. Sabrina's family and friends started to notice some strange behavior. In the weeks after Rob's funeral, this young guy here started showing up at the widow's house more and more. He brought her flowers, cooked for her. There was always dinner there for the widow and the kids, okay? He was always there at the house, always hanging around, present. For the detectives, the situation finally became obvious and even disturbing, right? The lover who had confessed his passion, who never left Sabrina, and now with her husband dead, there was no one else in the way, and he started hanging around her house, bringing flowers. It was suddenly the classic picture of an obsessed lover who lost his mind to be with the woman he loved. The detectives pulled the phone records for both of them, and it was no small thing. There were thousands of calls and messages between Sabrina and this guy. And it wasn't the kind of contact you'd expect from someone who ended an affair like Sabrina had promised her husband, okay? It was the kind of contact from someone who was really in love, you know? So they decided to tap the phones. And it's in these wiretaps that this story gets a lot more complicated. Because the investigators were hoping to catch the two lovers red-handed, right? Then they'd need to prove the causal link in the whole story. But they caught two lovers who talked about God all the time and much more. But the religious talk, in a way, sounded like a confession. In one of those calls, he said he loved her so much, called her my girl. In others, the two of them prayed together, you know. They called themselves sinners, dirty people. They said they had been selfish. They asked for forgiveness. There wasn't any sentence there that said, we killed Rob. It was implied. There's even a call where he said the following, hi, God. And he went on to say that he was on his knees for a reason. And there was a moment that sums it all up, okay? The two of them compared their own love story to a passage from the Bible. The story of King David and Bathsheba. And for those who don't know, this is the story of a king who falls in love with another man's married wife and arranges to send her husband to certain death so he can be with her. The two of them saw themselves in that story. Weird, right? But, as strange as it was to hear that, there was a technical problem. Nothing in the recordings, as I said, proved a murder plot. They talked about sin, about guilt, about a future together, but not about the crime itself. That's why I said in those calls it was almost a confession. The detectives had a damning character profile and practically no concrete evidence. Again then, the same wall, plenty of suspicion and not enough evidence. So the lead detective decided to set up a trap. He went to Sabrina and planted a lie. He calmly said that the investigation had hit a dead end, that there was nowhere else to go. The logic in his mind was simple. An innocent person keeps their routine unchanged after hearing that, right? They just go on as before. Maybe a guilty person would run to warn their accomplice, right? The guys cooled off and all that. And that's what happened. A few minutes later, Sabrina called the guy. And it wasn't through a regular phone. She used a disposable device, which gives us more evidence she didn't want to leave a trace, right? She called the guy and said, relieved, that everything was fine, that there weren't any more compromising questions they asked there. Everything's fine. So I ask you all, a widow who just lost her husband, after all, this is happening 15 or 20 days after the guy's death, would call her lover like that and say the investigation has nowhere to go. Thank God. It's weird, isn't it? Well, although it's weird, I must say it's circumstantial. But despite that, 3 months after the crime, on November 18, 2014, the investigators thought they had enough and arrested both of them. And this was when the young man's name finally appeared in the records, Jonathan Hearn. When they entered his house, it was almost like an inventory of evidence. A motorcycle, a helmet, a red bandana, a backpack, everything matching the description of the mysterious man filmed near the crime scene. There was even a bag full of saved receipts. It finally seemed like the end. The obsessed lover arrested, the evidence in his house, the case closed. But it wasn't like that. Because regarding Sabrina, the prosecutor looked at the material and concluded it wasn't enough. Everything that directly linked her to the crime was circumstantial. The prayers, the phones, letters, thousands of messages, none of that was the same as proving she planned to kill her own husband. So she was released. And then she took her 2 children and left. She moved far away from where she used to live to start her life over, right? Away from the community. Now people were looking at her kind of, you know, with suspicious looks, whispering. For Rob's friends, this situation was driving them crazy because everyone knew about it, and it seemed like that guy was being left with all the blame. And in his mind, the widow certainly had something to do with it, and she was just going to go on with her life as if nothing had happened. And so, time went by. A year, almost 2. And the more time passed, the more the whole thing seemed settled, just the way everyone had already understood. The deranged lover acted alone so he could have the woman to himself. But that story, just the way everyone believed, was completely wrong, and the person who was going to prove it was the last one anyone expected. Back at the beginning of 2017, just before the trial itself began, Hearn, the shooter, the imprisoned lover, made a decision that turned the tables, so to speak. He decided to tell everything. He made a deal with the prosecution. He now pleaded guilty to a lesser charge, manslaughter instead of murder, right? In exchange, he would tell everything he knew, testify against Sabrina. For cooperating, he would get a much lighter sentence than he would if he were tried as a cold-blooded killer. And with that deal in hand, the story everyone thought they knew collapsed, just like I said. More than 2 years after Ross's death, Sabrina, who had been released from her first arrest due to lack of evidence, was arrested again, this time with bail set at $3 million. She now pleaded not guilty to everything. And the trial in 2017 laid bare what had really happened in that warehouse. Because when the lover took the stand, he didn't describe the crime as a man acting alone out of obsession. He described a cold, calculated plan between two people. And that's when the fragile widow, the woman the whole community embraced at first, appeared in a completely different light. According to the lover, Sabrina wasn't just a supporting player. She was the one who provided the two pieces that made the murder possible. First, the map of the rail yard so he would know exactly where to enter and how to move around inside. Second, Rob's work schedule. Which day he would be assigned to that isolated spot over there, right? Where he would be alone, vulnerable. Of course, it wasn't a coincidence, was it? And who knew that? Who had that information at their fingertips? It was the guy's wife. And there's more. The lover also said that there was a first attempt before this one, which never even got off the ground, but the idea was to poison the pudding that Rob liked so much. For some reason, that plan didn't go forward, so they went with the gun plan. He described the day of the crime coldly, okay? He said he put on a mask, got on the motorcycle, and went to Rob's workplace. He stopped right in front of the office door, the warehouse there, and prayed. The man stopped to pray before going in and killing his lover's husband. Then he fired the first shot, saw Rob fall there, and staged the whole robbery scene. And before leaving, he went over and shot him in the face to make sure, there wouldn't be any witnesses. And the reason for all this, why would a woman order her husband to be killed instead of just getting a divorce once she met the fireman at that meeting in the supermarket when she was working? She wanted out of the marriage, met a guy she thought was her Prince Charming. Wouldn't it have been easier to just leave? Well, according to Hearn, the answer was exactly in that church she had returned to. Sabrina didn't think divorce was well regarded in her religious community. It's pretty crazy, isn't it? There she is, little Sherlock, thinking she'd come up with the perfect plan to kill her husband so no one would suspect a thing. So she would have said that Rob honestly would rather be dead than get divorced. She said they talked and he mentioned that losing her would, kill him, right? So she thought that was so I'll really kill then. In this woman's mind, killing had become, in a way, an act of mercy. And the woman who turned to God to escape a life that, according to her, was a life of sin, ended up using her own faith as a justification to order her husband's death. But now, guys, to be fair, and this is very important for the case, Sabrina's defense had a different version of events, okay? According to her defense, Hearn acted alone, driven by his own obsession, and was lying on the witness stand to save himself. You know how it goes, right, guys? When everything falls apart, it's over. The passion ends, the fans disappear, everything ends. After all, he would only get a reduced sentence if the story he was telling there convinced the prosecution. Someone with that kind of incentive, right, everything to point the finger, isn't exactly the cleanest witness in the world. Don't you agree with me, guys? That's what I said, right, to be fair, that I need to present both points of view. Sabrina herself later denied the plan, denied the poisoning, denied having given the layout of the place or her husband's work schedule. She even said that she would be the last person to want her husband dead because the way things were, she already had the best of both worlds, a husband at home and a caring lover on the side. About the recordings, she explained that she told Hearn everything because she trusted him and because he had warned her about the dangers if the affair was exposed, about how the police think and work. In her version, she wasn't coordinating any crime on the recordings. She was just following the advice of a man she trusted. How cute. So the jury had to choose between two stories. On one side, a confessed shooter saying she was the mastermind behind everything, and on the other, a widow saying she was just another victim of an obsessed liar. What a mess, huh? But a question came to my mind here. When Rob appeared dead, this woman, assuming she's telling the truth, okay, based on her statement, never suspected the lover then? After all, if she's now calling the guy obsessed and her husband turned up dead, did she never suspect him? To notify the police? To take a look at the guy? Seriously, strange, at the very least strange. And the jury? No, they bought her story too. At the end of 2017, Sabrina was convicted on most of the charges. First-degree murder, conspiracy, solicitation of murder, and being an accomplice. There was only one charge she was acquitted of. It was precisely that supposed poisoning plot. For all of that, she got 25 years to life plus 16 months in practice. It means she could be in prison for the rest of her life, or at least for 25 years. As for Hearn, because of the deal he made, he got the sentence agreed upon in the deal. About 25 years and 4 months for the lesser charge. The man who put on the mask prayed at the door of the crime scene and shot the victim in the face to make sure he was dead. He got a sentence that, I don't know, you guys tell me in the comments what you think, but despite all that, Sabrina still tried to turn things around, okay? She appealed, asked for a new trial, claimed she had been poorly defended and that the key witness had lied, but the courts didn't give in. In 2022, the Court of Appeals upheld the conviction on all charges. And look at that, right, guys? To think that if Mr. Hearn, the lover, hadn't had a moral crisis, let's say, maybe Rob's death would have gone on as planned by the criminals, right? A staged robbery. And the strangest thing is that it wasn't carelessness, right? It was part of the plan. It was intentional. A man who had put on a mask, prayed there, like I said, suddenly had a crisis of conscience and called Rob's best friend, the victims, to ask for forgiveness. Rob was only 38 years old. He was the father of 2 small children. He didn't have any enemies. And that was true until the end, okay? What he had was a wife who, in front of people, was the most fragile widow in the world, the one who needed the most support, and who, away from all of that, had drawn for her lover the exact map of where and when her husband would be alone to die. Man, what a bizarre case, right, guys? Because, the motivation here is really to get rid of the guy, right? Nothing was said, at least I didn't find anything about whether there was any other benefit they would get from this, right? Maybe there is, right? In the United States, when someone kills their spouse, there's always life insurance involved. But anyway, assuming that everything they said is true, right? In the sense that getting divorced will be frowned upon by the community, so Rob will end up dead in a robbery gone wrong. And deep down, it feels like the guy really regretted it, right? Because he called Rob's best friend to basically turn himself in, didn't he? Unbelievable. Share your thoughts on this episode in the comments. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and join as a member if possible. It really supports my work. A kiss from the redhead. See you next episode.